Hi, this week we'll be starting To Kill a Mockingbird, which is my favorite novel of all time. And I bet if you go home and talk to your parents about it, they probably read the book as well when they were in school. It's important to know a little bit of background information about the book because the author drew heavily from her own life as influence in the novel. She was born in 1926, which was 3 years before the stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression. She lived in a town called Monroeville, Alabama, which is the model for Macomb County, which is the setting of the novel. Her father was an attorney, and he had a case defending two black men who were accused of killing a white storekeeper. And because of racism during that time, both were hanged for the crime, even though there was a lot of evidence to suggest that they could not have committed the crime. He was good friends with another writer named Truman Capote since kindergarten. He moved to New York City in third grade but visited every summer, and he is the inspiration for the character of Dill. If you've ever seen the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's or read the book In Cold Blood, he was the author of those books. She never wrote another novel. Now, recently, another version of To Kill a Mockingbird, it was the first draft, was published under the title Go Set a Watchman. A lot of people refer to it as the sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, but that's not actually true. It was the first draft, and then she rewrote it to become To Kill a Mockingbird. So really, this was the only book she ever wrote, and she declined most interviews and public appearances until she died just a few years ago. So it was published in 1960. So it takes place during the Great Depression, but it was published during 1960, which was the height of the Civil Rights Movement. It won a Pulitzer Prize in 1961, and it remained for 88 weeks on the bestsellers list, so a year and a half on the bestsellers list. There are currently 30 million copies in print, and it's published in 18 languages. In 1962, they made it into a film that won 4 Oscars. So considering that she only ever wrote one novel, to win the Pulitzer Prize, have that many copies in print, and the film version win an Oscar is a pretty accomplished task. So let's talk a little bit about the 1930s when the novel takes place. So this was during the Great Depression. It was caused by the 1929 stock market crash, which left many people homeless, like this woman right here. Many families lost their homes, they lost their businesses, and they had to live out of their cars and their trucks. Some of them even moved to little kind of box cities or shanty towns, like we see right here in this picture, where people kind of congregated on vacant lots and made homes out of anything that they could. The problem was further worsened because of poor agricultural practices. Those agricultural practices resulted in the drying up of soil, and the soil literally dried up, turned to sand, and caused these huge dust storms in an area of the United States they referred to as the Dust Bowl during the time, and it decimated farms. So agriculture was a common profession for most families back then, and that became null and void. It was also a time when schools were segregated. So if you were African American, you attended a different school than white children. So let's learn a little bit more about the Great Depression. It started in 1929 and it lasted till the late 1930s, early 1940s. It began with a stock market crash on October 29th, 1929, on a day known as Black Tuesday. So people freaked out when this happened and they took all their money out of the banks, so the banks had to close. At that time, the unemployment rate was 25%. So 1 in 4 people was actually unemployed. In 1929, the year prior to the stock market crash, it was less than 4%. Just to give you an idea, currently our unemployment rate nationally is 4.3%. So let's talk a little bit more about the Great Depression. The rural South had it the worst, which is the setting of the book. There was extreme poverty in the rural South because almost everybody relied on agriculture, and that was part of the Dust Bowl. So their way of making money and supporting themselves was gone. It ended when World War II began. The war effort gave people jobs. They had to manufacture tanks and weapons and other things to fight the war in Europe. So that gave people jobs in factories, and money started to be spent again. Now, she was writing the novel during the 1950s, which was when the civil rights movement started gaining steam. One of the big events of the civil rights movement was the integration of schools. So African American children and white children were attending the same schools, and this did not go over well with many white people, as you can see from some of the reactions in the background here. Okay, you can also see these young men right here are kind of picketing against the integration of schools. Here's a restroom sign right here. Literally, white people and African Americans had separate restrooms and grocery stores. During the Civil Rights Movement, they were fighting against something called the Jim Crow laws. They went into effect in 1876 after the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. And most of them ended in 1965. However, some of them were still in the books into the 1970s. And the Jim Crow laws mandated this notion of separate but equal in public facilities, but rarely were they ever equal. It ended with President Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to ban discrimination in public places, although that was a fight that really extended long beyond 1964. Some of the themes that I want you guys to look for as you read, and I really would like to see you annotate this in your book with some post-it notes, are racial injustice, different social classes, gender roles, Atticus as a role model, the loss of innocence, empathy or walking around in someone else's shoes, courage, doing what's right even though society may not approve. And then there's some symbols: dogs, birds, snowmen, flowers, fire, roly-polies, fences, and flowers. I know this all seems pretty arbitrary, but if you can manage to annotate for those themes and these symbols as you read, the paper that we'll write at the end is going to be much easier. So again, feel free to pause this, go back, watch it again, but it's important to know the context of the novel. It takes place during the Great Depression, but it was written during the Civil Rights Movement, both of times in our nation where civil rights and rights for African Americans living in this country were very hard to come by. So take this into account and use this as context as you read, and again, be annotating for those themes and symbols. Thank you so much.